Peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Al, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about what is known as the Kybalion and the 7 Hermetic Principles. This is essentially a composition of the study of the Hermetic Philosophy of ancient Greece and Egypt. And the reason why I want to talk about this today is because, I didn't read this right in the beginning, but after I started to notice some synchronicities and lots of coincidences popping up into my life, I started to do a little bit of research and eventually came across what is known as the Kybalion. And I started to read it, and it really helped to make sense of a lot of things that I was experiencing that a lot of people refer to as, in the spiritual community, as synchronicities. And the reason why I want to touch base on this today was because I think that this is an important read for anyone that is on the spiritual path. You probably have already heard about this and may have read it if you've been on the path for some time now. Maybe you haven't. And if you haven't, I hope that, we're going to go over a little bit on what each principle is, just reading and touching base with, how that exactly ties into the world and my own experiences with that manifesting in real time. So that's something that I hope that, inspires you a little bit, because I think that this is an important thing. And the reason why I don't just tell everything is because, one, that would take quite a while, right? I'm just kind of on here just brushing on some basic things that I've come across, as well as things that I've learned and experienced. But ultimately, the thing that I noticed about being on a spiritual path is that you have to do the work yourself. People can't spoon feed you information. Well, I mean, they can, but that's not how you grow. Think of it like this. You can't go to the gym and have someone do the push-ups and pump iron for you and have you get the results. When it comes to this information, I find it important to do your own studies, to do your own research, and come to your own conclusions. I find that to be a very important aspect of spirituality. That's a part of the work. So with that in mind, let's dive right in and talk about the first principle, the principle of mentalism, that the all is mind and that the universe is mental. And essentially, a little bit of what this book says about this principle is that it embodies the truth that all is mind, that the material universe, the phenomena of life, matter, energy, and short, all that is apparent to our material senses, is spirit, in which itself is unknowable and undefinable, but which may be considered and thought of as universal, infinite, living mind. And it also explains that all the phenomenal world or universe is simply a mental creation of the all. So that basically means that everything that you see this video right here, the phone that you're holding, or maybe the laptop or desktop that you're watching this from, right? To the clothes that you wear, to your genetic makeup, it's suggesting that everything, of you, of everything that you see, is a product of a thought. That everything that we see, do, and hear, interact with, and are, is a product of, the mind, the mind of what is called the all. And, you can have your own viewpoints, opinions on that, totally fair, and you should, And personally, I sort of found this to be that there is something to this, and I'll get into that story a little bit later on. So everything is mental, all it is in the mind, and the mind is in the all. Now, the second principle is the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. You've probably heard that before if you spent any time in the spiritual community. And what this basically means is that it is suggesting and hinting of the idea that there are things, there are planes, dimensions, whatever it is that you want to call it, that are beyond what we experience and beyond what we know. And whatever's happening on that level is happening down here as well. For instance, we were all sort of getting a little nervous when, relations between Donald Trump and Iran were getting a little heated. And there would be people in the spiritual community that would suggest that the reason why that is happening is because there are things going on higher planes that are happening, causing a trickle-down effect into our so-called 3D reality. Again, have your own opinions, do your own research. I'm still trying to formulate my own truth, but that is basically what it comes down to, is that everything happens on a higher level first, and it comes down. And whatever's happening down here is reflective of what's going up there. And not only does that correspond to different planes, right? It's also on this level as well. And a really good example of this is think of the state of your room, right? Ask yourself, is your room clean or is it messy? If it's clean, chances are you're probably a more organized person. You probably have your life more together than, say, the average person. I don't know. That's probably the case. Maybe you just have a maid that comes in and does everything for you, right? But, as in contrast, where if you do have a room and, it's messy, you've got laundry on the floor, you've got you got like a plate of foods, that's sort of been out for a couple days, and it's kind of gross. Well, that's a reflection of what's going on in your mind. That would tell you that person with that messy room is not organized. They don't have their life together. They may not necessarily have the right priorities in mind, hygiene priorities. That's just one of many examples. So that is the principle of correspondence, as above, so below. Number 3, the principle of vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, and everything vibrates. This principle embodies the truth that everything is in motion, everything vibrates, and that nothing is at rest. This principle explains that the differences between different manifestations of matter, energy, mind, and even spirit regularly result from varying rates of vibration, and that all is in vibration. The higher the vibration, the higher the position in the scale. The vibration of spirit is at such an infinite rate of intensity and rapidity that it is practically at rest, just as a rapidly moving wheel seems to be motionless, and that there are gross forms of matter whose vibrations are so low that it seems to be at rest. So, this sort of is talking about something that I think a lot of us are more familiar with, just because, we learn a little bit about this in the public school system, is that, everything is made of energy. You have the atoms, you have the different molecules and things of this nature, and that essentially everything is always moving, but it's moving at different rates. You have a more solid object like this, it's moving at a slower rate than, say, gas particles. Nothing really new to say there, but it's one of the principles and philosophies that have been around that has been confirmed by modern science. So that's something to keep in mind. Up next, we have the 4th principle, the principle of polarity. This is one of my most favorite principles. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths, and all paradoxes may be reconciled. And that this principle embodies the truth that everything is dual. Everything has 2 poles, a pair of opposites, all of which are old Hermetic axioms. So that's a little self-explanatory, and that I see that applying on every single level. You have, and this ties into not just ideas and concepts, but also just the nature of reality. For instance, 2 poles, male and female, hot, cold, up, down, left, right. You have the ocean, you have the sky, or the sea and the sky. You have good and bad, and some of the more polarizing things that I have seen in recent times is that you have things like, Democrats and Republicans. You have vegans and carnivores. You have, religious people and, the atheist. And it goes on and on. And the thing, and I want to extend a little bit on that, because I've sort of learned in my own experience that when you are polarized to a specific side of the spectrum, you are actually much more easy to influence and control than if you were to, say, be more neutral or be in the middle, or what some may refer to as being depolarized. I'm a fan of being depolarized because you're less susceptible to being influenced and having a knee-jerk reaction towards things, and you have more self-control because you're able to say, if someone says something to you and it's something to consider, you can sit down with that and logically and rationally think it through, flesh things out, do research, so on and so forth. Whereas if you are, say, polarized to be a vegan, someone might suggest for you to do something and you go try to do it without doing your own research because you're so all for the movement, but then you hurt yourself because you don't necessarily understand nutrition, which I have seen with a lot of vegans. Nothing against vegans, right? I've got no bones to pick with anyone because I'm just living my life. I'm just trying to chill out. But it's an example and something that I have seen in the real life, in real time. And that's something that wouldn't have happened if they weren't so polarized, And this pretty much goes for anything. You have people that are gun owners versus people who believe that people shouldn't have guns in the United States. And the examples really go on. And wise wisdom that I have received is to be neutral, to be depolarized, so that you aren't influenced into a knee-jerk reaction that may not serve you. And one thing that I noticed too, before we move on to the next principle, is that sometimes, even though I like to exercise being in the middle, being neutral, sometimes it is fun to be polarized, Say if I am in a group discussion where a bunch of people are talking about X, Y, and Z about the other side, and I happen to find myself in this group, sometimes just for the heck of it, I'll engage with that. I'll enjoy the polarity, but that's only to have a little bit of fun, to spice things up, because I will admit that being neutral all the time, it does get a little boring, So that's just my little take on that. So, number 5, the principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is a measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. And that this principle embodies the truth that in everything there is manifested a measured motion to and fro, a flow and inflow, a swing backward and forward, a pendulum-like movement. And that this law is manifest in the creation and the destruction of worlds, in the rise and fall of nations, in the life of all things, and finally, in the mental states of man. And that's a little, especially right at the end there, that kind of really starts to highlight, emphasize what it's really talking about, is that, whatever direction things go in, it's going to happen in the other way. The really good example that it brought up was the rise and fall of nations. That's absolutely true. If you look at, I don't want to say history because that's from a certain point of view from one person or group of people. It's more like our story, right? So with our story as the human species, we can examine throughout the past and how things have played out over time, is that as nations rise and they fall, other people build nations on top of those nations, and they rise and then they fall. And it just happens over and over again. You have a really great moment, you have a terrible moment. Sometimes you have really great days, sometimes you have terrible days, and sometimes you have days that are just right, And essentially, when you're experiencing one end of the pole, you're going to eventually experience the other. And I think a lot of people, we don't necessarily know that. I mean, I think we do, but we don't really know that and understand it. And another thing that I want to say too, in terms of the principle of rhythm, is that, it goes not just for all things physically, but mentally as well. I mean, remember, we did talk about in the first principle that everything is mental, everything is in the mind, not just our minds, but the supposed mind of the all, as this book refers to. And that, if you think in one way, you're bound to think in the other way at some point. And understanding that, knowing that, and expecting that, I think can help us live better lives, because we'll be able to prepare for those low points and enjoy the high points. Number 6, the principle of cause and effect. This principle embodies the fact that there is a cause for every effect, an effect from every cause, and it explains that everything happens according to law, that nothing ever merely happens, that there is no such thing as chance, that while there are various planes of cause and effect, the higher dominating the lower planes, still nothing ever entirely escapes the law. The Hermeticists understand the art and methods of rising above the ordinary plane of cause and effect to a certain degree, and by mentally rising to a higher plane, they become causers instead of effects. But the masters, rising to the plane above, dominate their moods, characters, qualities, and powers, as well as the environment surrounding them, and become movers instead of pawns. They're very key here. They become movers instead of pawns. They help to play the game of life instead of being played and moved about by other wills and environments. They use the principle instead of being its tools. So they're using the tools of the principle of cause and effect as well as the other tools to play instead of being played, to move pawn pieces instead of being the pawn piece moved. And that the masters obey the causation of the higher planes, but they help to rule on their own plane. And that in this statement, there is condensed a wealth of Hermetic knowledge. So that's a little bit self-explanatory, and I read a little bit more into number 6 than the others because it pretty much explains itself. The principle of cause and effect is that until you essentially put out into the world with a cause, you're going to get the same effect of other outside forces impending onto you. And, I can talk a little bit about how I used to be overweight. I used to be insecure. I used to not really know how to talk to people. My speech just it didn't flow very well. I used to stutter a lot. And that was an effect from many things that happened to me, throughout my childhood. And I rose above that, and I became more than that. I became more fluent with my speech, I'm a little like, I'm just doing things as I go along here. I'm not using a script because, I'm just kind of going as I go along here. But, I lost the weight. I improved my speech. I'm able to socialize so much better with so much more fluency because I decided to, instead of being absorbing the effects of outside causes, I decided to take things into my own hands to empower myself physically, mentally, and emotionally, and as well as spiritually now, to put causes out there to yield effects that I desire. I decided to, instead of being played, I wanted to play the game on my own terms. And, I incorporate spirituality to help me do that. And that's a big passion of mine that I have that I'd like to share with you guys. So the principle of cause and effect, very powerful, very huge. Play or be played. Now we have number 7, the last and final principle. The principle of gender. This principle embodies the truth that gender is manifested in everything, the masculine and feminine principles ever at work. This is true not only of the physical plane, but on the mental plane and even the spiritual planes. On the physical plane, the principle manifests as sex. On the higher planes, it takes higher forms, but the principle is ever the same. And no creation, physical, mental, or spiritual, is ever possible without this principle. Every male thing has the female element, and every female contains also the male principle. And so essentially, it's not a principle that talks about just, getting together and having a good time. That's, it's way, way beyond that. Although that certainly is a part of it, it's under the umbrella of the general principle of the principle of gender. Masculine and feminine, the masculine tends to be seen as the force that pushes, that gives, something that puts things out there and does things, whereas the feminine is often a force or a concept that is seen, that is receiving, that takes in, that absorbs. And that really makes up our universe because, we balance things out to basically build things, to talk about things. Conversations is one example. one person may be talking and giving their own viewpoints, their own expertise, ideas, and concepts to one person, and that's playing a more masculine role. The other person now, regardless of whether they are male or female, then they start talking, and now they're serving the role as being in the role of the masculine, putting out there, pushing something out into the world. And whenever the person is receiving and taking in the information, they're serving the feminine role. They are absorbing, they're taking in, they are receiving. And that is on every level, not just, of course, on socialization, but say when you're building something, you put something there, that is masculine. But at that same spot where it's essentially where you're putting something, say you're putting like a Lego brick, like on a piece of table, right? You putting that brick onto the table and the table just being there and taking in that brick, right? For a lack of a better word, that's a demonstration of the feminine principle. And these are things that really constitute our life. Again, these are Hermetic principles. They are philosophies. Take what you will. If it resonates with you, great. If not, maybe let that sit in the back burner of your mind, and just maybe think about it or not. It's totally up to you. And those are essentially the 7 Hermetic principles. And I just want to talk about 1 or 2 of them because I've really seen them play out in my life big time, And one thing that I want to, remind you as well is that I've said it on my other videos on this channel, but I want to say it again. Anything that I say or anything that anyone else says, you have to take it with a grain of salt, prove it and demonstrate it for yourself, because it's equally foolish to accept what one person says blindly as it is to dismiss something outright, without any investigation whatsoever, and that's what I do. That's why I go through these books, I can kind of show you that I pretty much go through this entire book and I highlight everything, every single page. I read through it, and I read through it more than once because I want to understand and prove to myself or disprove what's real, what's not real, what is applicable and what's not, So that's just something that, I always tell people, you just take it to the next level and see for yourself. So with that in mind, with that being said, one of my earliest experiences during when I was first starting the spiritual path was experiencing the law of mentalism, that the all is in the mind and the mind is in the all. So I was working at a restaurant. I was working outside, and I was working with this new coworker that I've never worked with before. I didn't know his name, he didn't know mine. We'd never seen each other prior to this. And we're working together, and work gets a little busy. And essentially, I just kind of train him how to do X, Y, and Z at this location. And we work for a couple of minutes. And finally, when things slow down, keep in mind, this is, you've probably seen in my videos where I have sort of a beard, I have the mustache growing out. I look a little older, than what I look like, than obviously if I don't have those features. And because of the way that I speak, my vocabulary, what the things that I'm sort of into, such as spirituality and reading, people often regard me as a little mature for my age, which I take as a compliment. And then if you take that and you couple it with having a beard and facial hair, then people have taken me as being a little older, sometimes a lot older than what I am. So with all this in mind, this coworker walks up to me and he's looking at me to my face, and he says, "Are you 23?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am 23. How did you know?" It's like, I look a lot older than 23. I sound older. The things that I'm into is not typically of people like in their early 20s, and he just said, "I don't know. I just thought you might be 23. And I sat there and I thought to myself, that can't just be all of it. I want to understand his thought process as to how he arrived to 23. How long has he been thinking about it? So at the end of the shift, when everything is all said and done, we're pretty much just packing everything up, I sat down with him, right, as we're sort of, doing some paperwork. And I asked him, and I said, how did you know that I was 23? Like, that is not a lucky answer. You somehow knew that I was 23. He said, I don't know, right? Of course. I'm not just gonna sit at that answer. I really want to understand this and dissect it and see what it is at a fundamental level. So I asked him a couple questions. I said, okay, were you juggling numbers as to what I could be? Did you think, I could be 26, 22, 27, 25? And he said, no. He didn't have a process of just trying to rotate numbers and see what felt right. He didn't have that. And then I said, okay. So when you looked at me, and I looked at him, I said, when you looked at me, did the number 23 just come to you? And he said, yes. I said, okay. You looked at me, and the first thing that came to your mind, whether you saw it, felt it, or heard it, was 23. And he said, yes. And I was like, okay. That's how it works. It's like he downloaded it from somewhere, not doing it intentionally or consciously. And I took that as a sign that whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to say, it's the universe, whatever it's a higher power, whatever it is, whatever your truth dictates. I was open to the idea, not believing it outright because, investigation is important in my book. But I decided to be open-minded to the idea that something was communicating, by downloading information to him that would be received, by me, and that I would be willing and I'd be able to see that for what it is, a potential sign, a message of some sort to let me know that there is something more to the universe than what I already know, and I took that as a good sign. And on top of that, on the same night, because, there's a couple of people that I like to talk about this, like on the phone or in person, I thought that, this is a really interesting thing that I want to tell this person. And so I called up a buddy of mine, and the first thing, I kid you not, the first thing that he said to me was, bro, I can't believe it. I was just thinking about you, like as if he was thinking about shooting me a text, seeing what's going on, give me a call, whatever. And, I've experienced that sometimes if you think about someone, with enough intensity, not like trying to blow your brains up or focusing really hard, but, if you really just all of a sudden you get really amped up and you just gotta tell somebody about something, my experience is that a lot of the times, if given enough time, that person will be thinking about you, and they'll let you know after they say, hey, I was actually just about to text you, or hey, I was about to call you, and that happened at this point. I had this really these intense thoughts that I have to share this experience with my buddy, and then I go to call him to share that experience, and then he says, hey, I was just thinking about you. That just added to the idea and gave, for me, validity behind the first Hermetic principle, that everything is mental. The mind of the all, is in everything. And, that was sort of that was like a kick in the boot that I had to be more open, spiritually speaking, to studying this stuff and to take it seriously, until I can prove it to myself. And another thing, that I already talked about it, but it's the principle of polarity. Polarity is a very interesting thing. You can utilize polarity you can do a lot of things with polarity, I found that a really great way to connect with people is to recognize what things that they find to be, like what things are they polarized in. For instance, say if I have a buddy who's a vegan, right? And I'll, if I know that and understand that, I'll basically just talk about vegan stuff with him or her, and we can have engaging, interesting dialogue. And I can basically use this to do a couple things. To one, build a better relationship with this person. Two, understand more about what it is that they're into, because they're obviously going to know more about it than I am, because they're more polarized. They're more invested into the idea. They've done things to engage, to be a part of that label. And it's a great opportunity for me to see what's on that side and see what's going on, and to learn about it, and that I can take that information and walk with it moving forward without having to spend the time to get those experiences and knowledge, wisdom, and information. So that's one thing that I utilize polarity for, is to learn more about other things that I don't have expertise on, but I can get general knowledge that would have taken me longer to attain. I hope that makes sense for you. That's what I use polarity for, and it's a very powerful thing. And I think that it's important that, if you do find yourself polarized in some things, evaluate that, and that might not be a bad thing. You might look at that and say, okay, I'm in a pretty good spot because I'm so-called polarized, but I don't suffer any consequences from it. Well, that's up to you. Do what is right for you. Do what helps you, not only help yourself, but also helps others. I think, that's a little personal thing that I have. I think that once you help yourself, it's great to help others, but that's, that's just me. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say here. I really enjoyed this book. Again, it's called the Kybalion, the 7 Hermetic Principles, the study of Hermetic philosophy of ancient Greece and Egypt. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you to do so if you are on the spiritual path. Even not, it's still philosophy, and it's definitely something to, to add to your knowledge of information. So with that being said, I hope you got lots of value out of this video. And if you like this video, then I ask for you to kindly click that like button. And if you haven't already, join me on my spiritual journey by subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell icon. When you hit that bell icon, it lets you know and be notified whenever I push out a new video, which is 2 times a week, one on Sundays and another on Wednesdays. And with that being said, again, thank you very much for watching. In my native tongue, I say, ha hom.